Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is a show where we bring you up to date with all the latest political happenings on the continent. I am Benga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. It's a Friday edition of the conversation right here on News Central TV. Now, today we will be looking at the development in Guinea, where deposed President Alpha Conde is facing criminal charges. Also, we understand that presidential elections in Somalia has now been fixed for May 15th. And while we have presidential elections for Somalia as May 15th, we also know that the military leader in Guinea has proposed a 39-month civilian transition of democracy. And of course, that has sparked a lot of controversies, both internationally and also among regional leaders.
Now, Guinea's Attorney General has ordered legal proceedings against former President Alpha Conde and 26 of his former officials. The charges against 84-year-old Conde and his allies range from complicity, murder, and assault to destruction of property while in office. Other alleged crimes include detention, torture, kidnapping, disappearances, rape and other sexual abuse and looting.
Now, Conde was removed from office in September 2021 by army officers led by Colonel Mamady Doumbouya. Doumbouya, the head of Guinea's military junta, announced on April 30th that he had opted for a 39-month transitional period before a return to civilian rule. Now, joining us live on the conversation today is Dr. Hassan Kanenje. He is the director, Han Institute for Strategic Studies in Nairobi, Kenya. We also have Kunle Falowo, a global affairs analyst, joining us from Indianapolis, United States. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us on the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start with you, Dr. Azad. Now, we heard of these allegations against Conde, a lot of stringent allegations, I must say. Do you see this as a ploy to crack down on corruption or the civilian administration?
I think, Rita, anytime there is a coup, there is always an attempt to try and legitimize the actions as well as consolidate its role. And what the military junta is doing right now is to trump up allegations. Some could be having merit. Some could be because they're simply purely, politically motivated to try and marginalize, of course, those who support the ousted president, as well as send a message to the population, the public, that the junta is trying to do something different from the previous administration. Now, this is not to say that the government of Conde was clean. Absolutely not. In fact, by attempting to re-engineer itself through some, removal of constitutional limitations to run again, was doing exactly the opposite. What the President Conde had actually fought for many, many years as one of the leading pro-multi-party democracy activists in Guinea. And so, this, we can only read it from a point or a perspective of a junta that is trying to legitimize itself, consolidate its power, as well as marginalize its opponents.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanenje. Now, Kunle, this junta has been in office for quite some time. Why is this coming at this point? Is there any significance to the timing? Because traditionally, when a government takes over, when there's a coup d'etat, some of the reasons why they give is because of X, Y, Z reasons, and corruption most times happens to be one of the reasons. So why is this coming at this time?
The agitators and people that come around to do these things, which is very unconstitutional and undemocratic, are pretty much feeding into the public sentiment. The people are clamoring for a democratic change, and they want their lives to be better off. And then the military personnel and military officials, what they simply do when there is a public outcry, most especially if you look at the economy of those countries, they're pretty much not the things that we need to see. There's poverty, there's prevalent hunger and starvation, and this would escalate and agitations from every corner. And then when you have the political elites who are not interested in giving powers and conducting elections that will guarantee a rule of law and respect for the outcomes of the elections, you will have military people come in and intervene. Now, are we saying that it is all right for military personnel to intervene and undergo a coup and do all of those things? It is not acceptable in a democratic government. But be that as it may, all of the political elites, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have a prevalence of coup, they're all complicit, and it's just very pathetic at this point.
All right. Thank you so much, Kule. Now, over to you, Dr. Zad. I was watching the clip and I saw a bit of residents who were claiming that supposedly this allegations against Conde is more like justice being served, especially to those who died during the crackdown of the last elections. And this brings me to the elections in 2020 in October, where we saw Conde coming back in the third term. What do you think went wrong? Because a lot of people have said that this particular election, which brought Conde in his third term, actually brought a lot of political crisis in Guinea. Do you feel that was actually the problem, especially when you look at this recent political crisis in Guinea?
There's been a trend by sitting presidents to try and interfere with the constitutional limitations so they can be able to stay in power. Now, what I think they fail to understand is the general public tends to be very impatient, especially when leaders insist on staying in power, but without the accompanying progress being registered in the country. And so, considering the level of poverty and desperation that exists in the country, and Guinea is fairly a poor country, generally speaking, I think it was a massive strategic mistake and an error for Conde to attempt to do something which he's actually been campaigning against for much of his political life. And so that provoked, I think, resentment on the streets. It is highly likely that he may have won that election, actually. But the perception of interfering or messing with the institutional and constitutional order to extend his limit, I think, created a sense of discontent, not just within the local population, but even internationally. It greatly affected his legitimacy. And then that planted the seeds, of course, and an excuse for the military to take action. And it was a very convenient excuse, which, of course, most militaries nowadays, they've seemed to be able to draw from in conducting constitutional changes in government. And yes, it is true that there were crimes that were committed, especially during that agitation and the kind of protests that, of course, followed, or accompanied that election, which was highly disputed. And in response to that, generally, because the status quo never leaves power willingly, I think the government of Conde responded in a way that was improper and in certain circumstances, probably criminal. However, this would not have been the case, for instance, had Conde allowed a constitutional change in government, even with the kind of the purported crimes, that are right now being alleged. But because it was, he went against the popular will and the general sense that perhaps many Guineans did not want him to continue, it has created a fertile ground for the military to be able to, or the military government to be able to bring up, this government. But of course, again, I'm not trying to excuse him that he's clean. But if the context were different, I don't think these charges would be there. But of course, it is important also to send a message that say, if you're going to commit crimes while in office, you're going to be held to account, whether it's a democracy or whether it's a dictatorship.
Now, staying with you, I'll still like to stay with you, Dr. Kanenje. Former President Alpha Conde is 84 years old. A few months ago, he was allowed by the junta to travel to the United Arab Emirates for medical reasons, and he's since returned to the country, and they declared that he was no longer under house arrest. It comes as a surprise to see all these charges leveled against him at the age of 84. Do you think it's a distraction tactic by the junta, or are they serious about justice being served?
I think there are two ways to look at it. One, the junta is not delivering on the economic, promise, it offered to people. The vision they offered, they've not been able to realize it because, frankly, economics works differently, as opposed to, the politics of it. And so the politics might have sounded good, but the economics, of course, is resisting that change. Secondly, if in fact it's true that he's no longer under house arrest, then bringing up these charges is actually an indirect way of ensuring that he is constrained when it comes to action. Because once you get someone out of house arrest, there's a chance as a critical player within the Guinean body politic, he may, there's fear that perhaps he may start mobilizing, or at least people may start using him as a symbol around which they're going to mobilize. And given also the ethnic division and chasm that exists in Guinea, you may have his community, especially his ethnic group, perhaps mobilizing to support perhaps him to return to office. And so these charges are meant, number one, to ensure that it's going to constrain his ability to maneuver politically, both within the country and outside. But number two, it's also convenient distraction to continue blaming the former president for the inefficiencies that right now we see, or the lack of progress within Guinea.
All right, Conde, now while we're still looking at the issues of Conde being given several allegations, we also know that early this week, the military leader, of course, and the president of Colonel Mamady Doumbouya, for the first time, gave a particular timeline for transition to civilian government, which he said 39 months. Now, opposition members have said that or rather we heard reports that some opposition members actually boycotted the consultation process. Now, do you think that this has any legal basis, that decision for 39 months when some opposition parties actually boycotted the consultation has any legal basis?
Of course, there's at this point there's a cause for concern based on the fact that there's no country that has been very successful when it comes to military juntas giving promises and fulfilling those promises. Most of them haven't really delivered on those set promises. But having said that, Doumbouya as an individual is only 41 years old. A little bit of spotlight on him. He was part of this government, this 84-year-old president who has been ousted by this 41-year-old Doumbouya. He was part of the government. He had been a personal security guard for quite some time, and he was entrusted the life of the 84-year-old president. So along the line, things happened, and then he took over and conducted, did what everybody's talking about right now. But being that as it may, he had called all the political elites, and he had summoned them, and they had obliged, and the ones that weren't the ones that weren't ready to come, he had promised that he was going to personally arrest them, and most of them are coming in and having these conversations. But on the broader scale of things, 39 months, it's quite far away, but politically it's easier because it has to be consultations far and near. It's not only in Guinea that this is going to be happening. Don't forget, this is it used to be a French colony that had independence for the past 60 years, and they have mining, so there's an international pressure also. This is not just happening locally. The AU and ECOWAS is also going to be intervening in the entire process. So it's a long way to freedom at this point. But we continue to watch and see how development will continue to unfold in that particular country.
Thanks, Kunle. Now, Dr. Kanenje, looking at the geopolitical implications of this 39 months transition. The Guineans have been sanctioned by the West African Economic Bloc, ECOWAS. Will they get any reprieve from this proposed 39-month transition? And also, why, like you mentioned earlier, Alpha Conde was wrong to have extended his term limit. And if ECOWAS has seen the handwriting on the wall, why didn't they condemn that, what people are calling a democratic coup?
39 months is an eternity in the political life of a country. And strategically speaking, it is an attempt for the junta to buy sufficient time for them to entrench themselves in a way that even with elections after 39 months from today, they're still going to play a very important central role in the political process and in the governance of Guinea. Now, with regard to the writing on the wall, so far as the term extension is concerned, I think West African, the economic community there, as well as generally the African continent and the African Union in particular, it's torn. It is torn because there are no provisions within the Constitutive Act of the African Union that says you cannot extend constitutional, you cannot change the constitution to extend the term limits. It is something, it's kind of a gentleman's agreement that you should know that it is bad manners to extend the term limits. And so they don't have a legal basis for actually sanctioning a president or a leader of a given country not to change the constitution to extend the term limit, in part because those are internal affairs of each given country, to which the African Union holds dear, especially when it comes to non-intervention in internal affairs of a country, such as that one. Many presidents, including some of the leading presidents of the African Union, have changed their constitutions, to extend the term limit. Off the bat, you can name between 5 and 10, very easily, and they've been around for quite some time. And so that is one of the shortcomings of actually the African Union, that perhaps we should be able to revise certain aspects so that we discourage leaders from actually trying to live, to stay in office forever. Now, why not the condemnation? Again, there is no legal basis for that. Two, the African Union is weakened by the fact that at the top of it, because an organization is a reflection of its members, its own members, some of them who are supposed to be issuing those statements, are actually practicing that. And I think that is one thing that has denied the African Union the ability to be able to either sanction bad changes, especially when it comes to constitution changes within countries, as well as even sanction regimes once, of course, they assume power extra-constitutionally. Because apart from expelling countries from the bloc, for instance, what else has, for instance, ECOWAS or African Union do? Do they have enough sufficient sticks and carrots to be able to force certain arrangements? Now, that has been the question, and our continental bodies are risking becoming like toothless bulldogs now. Just in the last couple of months, or rather about 2 years, you've heard about 5 coups or attempted coups. Mm-hmm. Of course, that speaks to the kind of challenges that the African Union and African organizations are facing.
Okay, Dr. Conde, I will stay with you there, especially as you brought about the issues of recent coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea. Now, if we look at Mali, we know that international organizations have actually been pressuring these countries to go back to civilian rule. Now, Mali talked about holding on to power until 2025. Burkina Faso also proposed a 3-year transition. And now we have Guinea talking about 39 months or probably over 3 years. Do we see a pattern growing here among these military leaders?
Bad characters tend to learn from each other, and they perfect the art of bad manners. And so, because it's been seen to work elsewhere, and they've gotten away with it, it's emboldening would-be perpetrators of extra-constitutional changes in government to actually go ahead, not just set their own timelines, but undertake even more egregious violations, not just of their countries, but also of international norms and international human rights principles. And so it is going to be a challenge, for instance, to force the junta in Guinea to, let's say, limit it to 2 years, when we've, or at least as a continent and the international community, seem to be complicit in the fact that they've allowed other countries or other similar situations to go on for much longer or to set even much longer timetables. And I think that's the dilemma that the continent faces, is the dilemma that West African countries face, especially seen that the ones that have the most interest in Guinea, in part because it's a neighboring country. But it's a crisis within the continent that actually has to be addressed, not to mention the silent influence of external players, such as the former colonial players, and in this case in particular, the French.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, Kunle, just coming back to you, looking at the history of West Africa, there's always been coups in the 1980s and 70s. We're almost back to that era. That's why it was christened the coup belt. One of the reasons why military rulers plan coups is, they say, because of an extension in constitutional term limits, insecurity, bad governance, bad economic policies. But just like Dr. Conde said now, the African Union Charter does not give room for the African Union or other continental bodies to intervene or interfere in matters of, in domestic affairs of other countries. So going forward, how do we prevent these coups from happening? How do we stop those conditions that breed the military coups? Because we also notice that once coups happen, most of the civilian population welcome them with open arms. They're always happy and they see them as liberators. Going forward, how do we ensure that politicians in a democratic government really do what the people elected them to do, so as to avoid coups in the future?
Well, that's a very good question. Just like you just rightly mentioned, all of those elements are the major ingredients that facilitate or will entice military people to want to come into power. Most especially economic instability, political instability, chaos in the streets, hunger, starvation out there. When the people are not comfortable with the leader that they have, it's an open arms and an open invitation for the military people to come in and intervene. Don't forget, these are parts of the people. They're parts of the society that they all live in. So inadvertently, when the country is not being run by the political elites the way that they're supposed to, when you're entrenching in the safety and you're doing things quite opposite of your promises, of your campaign promises, and then the effect is very, very big and huge in the lives of the common man, and people will bring up arms, and there will be chaos in the street, and that is exactly what is happening when you have military people come in and quite do the interventions that we talk about. But how do we go forward from now is to make sure and ensure that all the political elites are hold people, especially the presidency in the democratic dispensation, hold themselves accountable to the people. It is very imperative that we all do it, and the freedom of press, the press are doing their parts in exposing the wrongdoings of the political elites, being accountable to themselves and being accountable to the people that elected them and given them power, entrusted them with the power, is also very imperative. This is a warning that to all just African countries altogether, that the military personnel are always watching. They will seize the opportunity of the grievances of the people, and will conduct a coup at any point in time. So how do we go forward? The African Union and ECOWAS put together, just like my counterpart rightly said, there are parts and parcel of all of this governing boards. The leaders are all together. They're friends outside of of the union. So these they have to hold themselves accountable. And they say absolute power corrupts absolutely. In the democratic dispensation, when the judiciary, the all arms of government are working the way it's supposed to, they wouldn't have a problem like this. It's the inefficiency of all the arms of government that would facilitate or necessitate a military junta to intervene. So going forward, respect for the rule of law and respect for the people and fulfilling all their campaign promises will help to avoid military coups in sub-Saharan Africa and just Africa in general.
All right, thank you so much, Kunle. Now, still going forward, Dr. Zan, call it a political gimmick, call it a delay tactic. We also know that in late September last year, when the military took over, they made a sort of charter for this transition, and the military leader constituted a legislative body called the National Transitional Council. It was made up of 81 members drawn from political parties, civil society, and trade unions, which is meant to draw up the new constitution. Now, has there been any progress on this?
Rita, that was a public relations exercise. It is always very opportunistic generally for military juntas. The first order of action is to try and build a semblance of legitimacy. And what better way to do it than form something with a national name called national transition, national constitutional, whatever outfit they're going to put to frame it with regard to the sense of nationhood. It's never about national aspirations, but it is a way to hoodwink the public and convince the international community that the regime at hand is one we can work with and is likely to be representative of the general wishes of the population. Not much progress has been made because no progress was ever meant to be made in the first place. Right now, they are keen in consolidating their power, they are keen in advancing their interests, and they're keen in being a critical player in the next constitutional dispensation or political dispensation. And I think that is why they're buying themselves sufficient time, because this young man who is current leader, he is inexperienced. He does not understand the political dynamics very well. He has limited experience when it comes to his international relations. And so this can buy him sufficient time to grow up, as well as get some foreign partners who may support his bid. We know that the phenomenon of the military taking over, of course, something which has reemerged, that we had thought perhaps, that era was slowly passing, is also sometimes quietly aided by some Western powers that may have an interest in the country, but perhaps they don't find it uncomfortable dealing with the status quo. And so not much progress that has been registered that's exactly worth talking about. And that formation and that outfit was a mere public relations campaign and nothing beyond that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. Now, Kunle, just before we wrap things up, so the junta has put out a transition period, and we're expecting reactions from the ECOWAS and international community. What do you think the reaction will be? And in your opinion, what's a workable transition period? What's a reasonable transition period that would keep both the junta happy and the ECOWAS happy? Because it's the ordinary Guineans that are feeling the bite of the economic sanctions on the country.
Quite simply, I would say transition of power is very imperative at this point. 39 months, it's a lot of time, and then time buying, which is very obvious. That's the gimmick they're trying to play. But going back to the ECOWAS and the African Union, it's what's the worst they could do? Expulsion. And that hasn't been efficient, obviously, but going forward, making sure that everybody involved in this are accountable will help the situation. And also, when we look at the prevalent condition in Guinea, since they've all registered or made intention known that they will still want to operate a democratic dispensation in that country, just like any other advanced countries, they have problems. In the democracy, it is never perfect. When you have too many people doing so many things, they will have, it's bound to be, discomfort and things that happens. But at the end of the day, when you come together in good intent and for the benefits of the entire populace of Guinea, it's very imperative that the transition of power goes beyond just saying it. It actually, in practice, happens, and it happens before the 39 months.
All right, thank you so much, Kule. Lastly, Dr. Zan, let's hear your view on it. Do you think there's going to be a middle ground, or do you feel the military junta is going to bow to pressure from the international organization? Because you would also know, you mentioned the issue of the sanctions placed by ECOWAS. Do you think there's going to be a middle ground?
Right now, the junta does not have any incentives to be able to compromise on that. They have an upper hand. The world seems to be distracted by the conflict in Ukraine, especially the international community, the Western countries in particular, that has the most influence to take action. They elicit with the United Nations and constrain it further. And so, at the moment, barring any dramatic shift in terms of interest in Guinea, they may actually just have their way. Absent of anything else, I see the status quo remaining in favor largely of the military. But if there are certain moves, especially by international financial institutions or Western institutions or the United Nations, then we are likely to see that change. But as I did mention, the West and the United Nations right now are least sitting members. They're distracted by the conflict in Ukraine, and I don't expect much action going forward, at least in the next few months.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan Kanenje, and thank you, Kunle Falowo, for your contributions on this subject. We do appreciate your insight.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. When we'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll be looking at the presidential elections coming up in Somalia. What are its implications for peace in the country? Do stay with us. We'll be right back. You're welcome back to The Conversation on News Central Television. In the first half of the show, we did look at Guinea, where the ruling military junta of Colonel Mamady Doumbouya has filed charges against former President Alpha Conde. It's now time to switch gears and look at the upcoming Somali presidential elections. Finally, a day has been set for the long-awaited Somali presidential elections. It will now hold on May the 15th. The Somali Parliament announced on Thursday that the long-awaited presidential election will finally take place, and that 329 lawmakers from both houses, 54 from the Senate or upper house, and 275 from the lower house will elect the country's 10th president. The committee said the presidential candidates will address Parliament on May the 11th and 12th on their policies ahead of the vote.
Now, the presidential election, which is 15 months behind schedule, comes after Somalia concluded parliamentary elections in April. Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed, known as Farmajo, whose term in office officially ended on February 8, 2021, has been under pressure after the election date passed without resolution of issues related to how the vote would have been conducted in Somalia. Now, we still have on the conversation with us to discuss this issue, Dr. Zan Kanenje. He is the director, Hum Institute for Strategic Studies, Nairobi, Kenya. We also have still with us Kunle Falowo, a global affairs analyst. Thank you so much for staying with us on the conversation.
Pleasure.
All right, so I'll start with you, Dr. Zan. We're looking at presidential elections in Somalia despite the political disputes. Are you confident that these elections will usher in a new era for Somalia and lead to peace and stability?
To the extent that it's going to usher in a new era, we do not know. What we know is that so far the procedural aspects have already been concluded, and we expect that Somalia is going to have a new president this year. Now, Somalia's election is one of the most unique, I think, in the region, if not on the continent. Now, first, they have a tradition of not electing the president more than one term. And that is why they also Farmajo being elected or re-elected as Lima. However, because the Mali's election, it's not a universal suffrage, and it's determined mostly last minute by whoever the leading candidates are, who tend to form a pact or get into a coalition to go for second round or third round of voting. It's not a conclusive fact that Farmajo may not come back. However, what is clear is whoever wins is going to make a fundamental shift in Somalia, in part because he will have to deal with a new parliament. He will have to deal with new expectations from the international community. Now, if Farmajo wins this election, for instance, it's expected that those changes may not be as fundamental. And there is a likelihood that the kind of tension that exists between the center and the periphery, which is between the federal government and federal member states, especially the state of Jubaland and Puntland, is going to continue, as well as some of the existing clan tensions within the country, including beyond Somalia, which is the regional tensions that have existed or characterized Farmajo's presidency. If, on the other hand, the opposition wins, right now, with the odds or the oracle seem to be speaking to the fact that the opposition candidate may win, it may mark a fundamental shift that perhaps may usher in a little bit of more inclusive government, but also more predictable and stable Somalia. What, of course, has to be done, and people have to keep in mind, is that this is a country that is still extremely fragile. And the African Union mission right now has since transitioned into a supporting ATMIS that is supposed to be actually offering more of a supporting technical, role in terms of capacitating the government to be able to function, helping out security. But whose task and mandate will largely be coming from the government, as opposed to independent action that they were taking while they were operating under the African Union mission. And so, to the extent that the next government is going to be able to work, I think, with these international partners as well as the ATMIS, is going to determine to what extent Somalia is going to be stable and to what extent is going to be able to rehabilitate itself within the international community.
Thank you, Dr. Kanenje. Now, Kunle, we do know the build-up to this elections, how it was stalled, how they've not been able to meet up with the timetable, and incessant attacks by the Al-Shabaab terrorist groups and election officials and also politicians of the country. So my question to you is this: how significant are these elections, and the fact that they're holding, does it mean that Somalia has turned the corner, or is it more of the same?
Well, turning the corner, we're yet to see that happening. It's a lifelong battle for the democratic or political life of Somalia. Having said that, Somalia is quite a complicated country when you look at just the dynamics of it. The political, the election, the way it's been conducted is quite very difficult. There's voter apathy. People aren't coming out to vote because they've lost the will and they've lost interest in the political elites. They don't trust their leaders anymore. Now, some other dynamics in Somalia I would mention is the international dynamics, which let me just mention this also. The International Monetary Fund it's told them that they will have to conduct the election before a certain date. And what they did was to oblige, because they will have to cut the fund, the international fund for Somalia. And why is this election coming in 2 days before the mandated time that the IMF had promised that they will cut in that international fund to Somalia? That tells me finances and money is involved in this. Now, also another dynamics in this political turmoil in Somalia also is the fact that Al-Shabaab, like you rightly mentioned, and Al-Qaeda, the Islam militancy group, are having a stronghold in Somalia. And if you're not, nipping these terrorist organizations in the bud by, cutting their operational procedure and their standard and not making them efficient, it will help the international community and avoid terrorists going from Africa and going into to strike and wreak havoc in the lives of other countries. So it remains to be seen how effective this politicization or politicalization will be. It's quite interesting what's going on, but we'll continue to look because money is involved. The international community is also involved because security for the world generally rests on the shoulders of Somalia. Based on the fact that the militancy group are having a stronghold in that country.
All right, thank you, Kunle. You've clearly pointed out that money is a very major factor, especially in Somali elections. You either have the elections or miss about $400 million. Now, Dr. Zan, let's look at the security situation. Do you feel it has improved to the degree that these elections are even taking place?
No, absolutely not. I think it's important to remember that just about 2 days ago, there was a massive attack against AMISOM forces, and those were Burundian, forces serving under AMISOM, and dozens of them, were killed. Even though the terror group itself claims, hundreds, but at least the AMISOM, I think acknowledges only about, maybe 3 dozens of them were killed. But that is a significant number, and that goes to emphasize how fragile the country is now. To the extent the election is being held, Somalia, people are not walking to the polls. There is no one man, one vote. So they are not really showing up to the polling stations. People who are voting right now, they're members of parliament. Yes, the members of parliament, the lower house, they have the lower house, the Senate, and, the Senate, the upper house, and then they have the lower house, the parliament, made up of 275 members of parliament. And then the upper house is made up of 54. And so these are the people who are actually going to determine who's going to be president. But an average Somali has not voted in an election in more than 3 decades, in fact, probably forever. Because they went back, they shut down the system of universal suffrage, and that is when the September 17, 2020 agreement that they reached was allowed them to go back to a system of elders.
And clans.
Yes, clan elders that bring forth a number of delegates, so about 14,000, then who determine the election of the subsequent MPs. And so that system means that right now, pretty much the game is being played in boardrooms among members of parliament. And yes, it can still proceed because it's a very few and small area, very few individuals in a small area right now where this thing is actually being done. But much of Somalia is still largely unstable. So AMISOM and some Somali security forces have managed to secure some areas in the capital. But even Villa Somalia, the seat of the president, it's not safe. And so Somalia is still largely a country that is actually controlled by elements, much like what was happening in Afghanistan. And I think what Al-Shabaab's calculation is to just wait it out until AMISOM forces are out, and with continuing fragility in the central government, or rather in the federal government, that perhaps they may be able to have another Talibanization of Somalia. And I think the Taliban move really inspired Al-Shabaab, and I think that is why they're still remaining persistent.
Now, finally, Dr. Conde, looking at the autonomous regions of Somaliland and Puntland, they seem to have been they seem to be stable and have been able to work without much international assistance in those regions. Should this be the template for the rest of Somalia? And will the situation improve if Somalis were left to solve their problems on their own?
There are many Somalis who think that if they were left to solve their problems on their own, they will do better. But you realize part of the reason they're having these elections 2 days before IMF cuts the money supply is because they don't have money. This is a government that relies on foreign donors to pay salaries, to pay the military, to run basic affairs of a nation state. And so without international intervention or support, Somalia stands zero chances of actually surviving. Now, is Somaliland and Puntland a template? Absolutely not. Somaliland has a fairly different history. And they claim they were forced into a marriage in 1960, which they abandoned at the beginning of the collapse of Somalia in early 1990s with the overthrow of Mohamed Abdullahi. Now, but one thing that is unique between Puntland and Somaliland is these are fairly viable regions that have ports and have economies that work, and they're also fairly homogeneous economically and also culturally. And you can even add Jubaland to the equation that have Kismail. And so they have assets or economic goods that can be able to actually run an economy fairly decently. The rest of the states, Galmaduk, Hirshabelle, and Southwest, they actually stand no chance of being able to survive on their own. Now, if we have to go that route, then perhaps what we can do is to try and give more autonomy to these states, which may rather create a feeling that they may not need the center, and perhaps exacerbate the kind of secessionist feeling that is already going on around among member states, especially during the Farmajo administration that used to have very poor relations between the federal government and the federal member states.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Zan. Colonel, let's have your final take now. What do you think should be the major priorities for the new president if Farmajo is coming back, or probably the opposition?
Quite simply, Somali right now is in a dire need of international aid. There is drought in Somalia, in Somali, like I said. According to some reports, about 3.5 million children are likely to die from drought, and another 1.4 probably from starvation and hunger. So there's really, in a real context, there's really problems with running the country, and people are really suffering. And this is just going beyond the political elites and just security. It has to do with the lives of the common man, the children, the vulnerable in the society. And these are all fundamental things that will be put into consideration when these leaders are coming together to come up with a plan. Of course, the international community are closely watching this development because the country is in dire need of international aid, and we just hope that they do the right thing by electing a leader that will help navigate this tumultuous situation Somali have found themselves because of ineffective governance for a long time.
Thank you very much, Kunle and Dr. Hassan Kanenje, for your contribution to the program today. We do appreciate your insight.
You're welcome.
And this is where we wrap up our conversation today. Join us next time on The Conversation. My name is Benga Bora. Thanks for watching.
I'm Rita Omwadia. Bye-bye.